My name is Hideo Mabuchi. By profession and by training, I'm a scientist. I'm a physicist. I teach down at Stanford University in the Department of Applied Physics. And my connection to art is really through ceramics and also recently a bit through fiber arts. As a scientist, most of my work has to do with quantum optics and developing new foundations for quantum engineering, including a bit of quantum information science. And as a maker, I would say that I'm very driven by materiality and sort of exploring the ways that natural materials kind of have their own agency in directing the way that a work of art unfolds, but then also trying to understand how one can layer a more personal expression sort of on top of that materiality. Well, I first heard about Djerassi from other people who had been residents here. Living so close, one runs into a few of them. And yeah, this particular session, I think, seemed like an appropriate one for me to apply for. I don't really have credentials as an artist, although sort of as a resident, I would say that I've really been working on the side of making things. And this session just seemed like one where it was a context I felt I could fit into reasonably well, and B, I was really hoping to meet interesting, like-minded people to learn from, to have conversations with. And that latter aspect certainly has borne out. Our group has really come together well. It's finally curated by the program collection of mainly scientists and mainly artists, but all of whom have a lot of interests in connecting the two spheres. And so we've had just fantastic conversations, both in groups and one-on-one. And really, that's been, I think for me, I'll look back at that as one of the most important takeaways from this time. The ideas that we developed together and the personal connections that we've made. And I certainly hope to be interacting with all these folks into the future. So during my time here, I actually came to this residency after a very busy work period. It was a stretch of many months in which I didn't make a single thing. So when I got here, the first thing that I was excited to do was just get on the wheel and throw some clay, make some objects, and just kind of get back into the swing of that. And I guess I wasn't really thinking too much exactly about what I wanted to do. Like many of the other residencies, I got excited about the possibility of proposing and installing an artwork out in the field. And so early on, I was thinking quite a bit about that. But then, so I'll say about a bit more about that in a second, but somewhat unexpectedly, it also came up. I had brought my potter's wheel up from home, as well as a small table loom. And when Tim saw me weaving on the table loom, he mentioned that Pamela Djerassi's old loom was actually still around in pieces up in a storage space. And so one day we decided to go up there and bring it down. And that, I think, for me actually became the central focus of what the residency has been about. Both the investment of time in reassembling the loom, getting it working again, making some work on it, but then also just sort of thinking about what it really meant to inherit somebody's tools, especially somebody so special to this program in this place. And it triggered for me a lot of very interesting thinking, both about what it was to make something artistic and to respond to that sort of very special circumstance, and yet also in the course of it try to have a layer of more personal expression and personal meaning integrated into that. So that has now come back around, I would say, to the installation that I had proposed and that I'm hoping to finish up any day now, where originally I had thought about a work where when we first went on our hike, it was just a tour of the grounds, looking at a number of the various sculptures and where they had been installed out in the woods. And one thing you immediately notice is that there's a particular area down by Harrington Creek, just below the picnic ground, where there's a lot of art installed. And it was interesting to step back and think about why there was so much artwork there. And it resonated with something that I've more generally been thinking about in terms of material agency and how you can sort of rationalize or wrap your head around the idea that non-living things sort of have a say in how events and histories unfold. And so that turned into an idea of, well, people like to work down there because it's a really nice place to be. It's very contemplative. It's a nice place to view art. It's a nice place to work making art. And that's because it's a cool, shady grove. There are all these large trees. You hear the wind in the trees. You hear the water flowing around the rocks in the stream. And so it's really something where it's fundamentally the water that's there that I think brings everything else. And so I have been thinking about a piece that's really about kind of gravity in rocks and water and the agency that that has in terms of calling people to a place. But now I've really come back around to that after this experience of working with Pamela's loom and the little piece that I made for that, about thinking how I can also layer a sort of a more personal story on top of that first idea. So, to come back around the question of how does this connect to things that I think about in the scientific part of what I do, I'd really say that in science, what interests me the most is identifying and highlighting and pointing out the sort of importance of recognizing unexpected connections between things. And so any of these sorts of things where you're really trying to layer meaning, layer two unexpectedly different meanings on the same substrate of some kind. If you're making things, then that's a certain material or a certain arrangement of material, and how that can really have an expression or a signification on two very different levels. I also find that in scientific work, that's the kind of thing that I like to do, where maybe you find a problem that needs to be addressed or a bit of theory that needs to be developed that can really draw upon ideas from surprisingly different fields, and that can sort of have significance of very different kinds. So, up until now, I've actually not been that interested in trying to make artwork about subject matter from the science that I do. I've done a little bit of scientific work about the materials that I use as a maker, but I think more what I've really been interested in is just the question of, well, if you're a person who does science and a person who makes things, even when the subject matter doesn't necessarily come together, if you live that way for some period of time, what is it that is important to you, right? I mean, what are the ideas that you find interesting? What do you want to do with your time? And so as a kind of personal reflection, I think this time here at Djerassi has been great for providing the time and space and resources to do that. But then also at a kind of a group level, we also have this situation where we have artists and scientists working side by side, and we've developed a sufficiently close personal connection that I think we talk a lot, not because we're trying to figure out something to collaborate on or anything like that, but just because we're interested in each other's points of view. And so on that interpersonal level, then it's interesting to see what comes up as things that we're all honestly interested in, even though we come at them from very different directions. So my own personal trajectory of coming to a place of doing both science and art, my training is all as a scientist. So up until 10 years ago even, I would say that really I was sort of maybe a typical scientist, spending too many hours a day, either early on working in the lab and then later on managing students and doing the whole thing of writing proposals, that sort of stuff. And I think it's fair to say that in science, you can develop your skill set pretty early on, and then it becomes natural to just work with that. And I think I came to a point where, I've always had a very casual interest in craft. Growing up in a Japanese household, you come into contact with quite a bit of fine craft. I had always been interested in that, just in a intuitive kind of way. And so at some point I decided that it would be fun to try to make ceramics, and I just got instantly hooked on the process. I think there's something about that kind of a very material-driven art form where really what you're doing is responding to the properties of the clay that you're using, what it wants to do. And then when I discovered, or when I was introduced to wood firing in ceramics, that was really a crazy thing where this is a process where you'll take unglazed clay and fire it in a wood-burning kiln. But despite the fact that the pots that you put in are white or beige, they come out with an incredible range of colors and textures. And so that's something I think, especially with a scientific background, that you want to know what's going on there. And, on the one hand, I think it's very interesting I've been very interested in utilizing contemporary techniques of surface analysis, microscopy, electron microscopy, to try and understand a little bit better about what's going on. Because really all you're doing in this process is you're taking clay, which is just what the Earth's crust is mostly made up of, you burn it in a wood-burning kiln, and something about the interaction of the hot kiln gases and the minerals in the clay leaves you with all these colors. So it's the kind of thing that I think as a physicist, it's irresistible to try to understand what's going on there. But then, that also to think about how that comes back into your practice of making, where just once you understand what those processes are and what these surfaces are, I think that it's another driver in the whole idea of materiality and wanting to develop ways to both express personally through the work that you make, but also to really highlight and sort of facilitate the way that the material wants to kind of express its own properties through this sort of a process. So yeah, that, as I think was implied in that narrative, art making for me is really a more recent thing, but it has kind of layered on top of the scientific training that I've had. And now, it's great to have a foot in both fields. I mean, I am always surprised by how easy it is to switch back and forth between a day of doing traditional sciencey things and a day of being in the studio. Yeah, so it hasn't been that long for me really doing this thing of trying to live both as a maker and as a scientist, and so I'm still exploring what that is. Yeah, next on the agenda, this is another thing where I would say that before coming here, I didn't really have a vision of how this residency might necessarily dovetail into things that I have on the rest of the calendar for the year or next year. But something that has come up, I've been very actively interested in trying to see how back at Stanford we can do things where we integrate art and science more into the undergraduate education. That I think at Stanford, as at many other places, we fight this problem that there's such a practical emphasis these days on engineering and computer science and fields like that. It actually can be a challenge to convince students that it's important to take time to really develop an artistic side, to develop notions of creative process. So previously I've done some teaching where I've taught a course, for example, on physics and ceramics, which is really a course about creative process, but really the idea is to help students develop and explore creative process in the ceramic studio, but then also to try to illustrate for them how that same kind of process can come back into what one does as a researcher or a scientist. And now, I think I come away from this experience with an even stronger conviction that it's important to find ways within the structure of the undergraduate education at universities like Stanford to really hold art and science up as things that one should really do in parallel, that are very complementary, regardless of what you think that you're going to do as a profession. These are modes of inquiry that I think every student should develop to some extent, and to have that experience of feeling that, well, there's no hierarchy between art and science. There's not even really a sense in which one is more useful than the other. They're just different ways in which you make sense of the world, and to be, I think, a complete human being, it's really great to have access to both of those disciplines. And so, I certainly come out of this with a few new ideas practically about how to approach those things, but really a much stronger and even stronger conviction that this is really an important thing to do.